In the last tutorial, we looked at basic V-Ray material settings. We went into the V-Ray material editor and looked at two different material types. We looked at setting up a simple material using a diffuse layer and then a slightly more complicated material using a diffuse layer and a reflection layer. And the results of that, that second material type can be seen here in the frame buffer. We have a black diffuse color paired with a reflection layer in the material, and this allows us to get nice mapping, a nice mapping of the environment onto the object. So we can now see that the V-Ray sun and sky system, which is implemented in this scene, is being picked up on the black reflective objects. We can see a little bit of the change in gradation as we go from a less blue area at the bottom, where you would expect the horizon to be, to a brighter blue at the top. And in this tutorial, I really want to go into the sun and sky settings, and also then look at other ways that we can bring environments into V-Ray to create even more dramatic effects. So first, we'll just I'm going to close the frame buffer and select our light. Select light. And now it's selected, we can't see it, but if I go to the properties window, I can, I only have one light in the scene, which is the sun. And I'm going to now go through and look at some of the basic settings that we have in the V-Ray sun and sky system. And the first thing that I want to look at is the sky model type itself. You can see here that we have Pritham as our sky model, and Pritham is just likely the name of the computer scientist that came up with this procedural texture. And if you hover over, you can see that we have a flyout telling us a little bit about the different sky models that we have available in V-Ray. By default, it's set to Pritham, and if I open the frame buffer again, you can see that we have this nice blue sky in our scene. And if I go back to the sun, obviously, the advantage of having this procedural sun and sky texture or system is that if I modify the sun, so right now we can see that the sun is coming at nearly a 45-degree angle. If I lower it and hit OK and re-render the scene, the lighting completely changes. So now the sun is much closer to the horizon. It looks like dawn or dusk. And so within this procedural sun and sky system, there's a lot of flexibility over how the scene is rendered. If we go back and modify the sun again and make the sun nearly overhead, hit OK. You can see now it looks much more like noon. It's incredibly bright, and we have a nice blue sky. And any procedural sun and sky model available in V-Ray is going to have this variation based on the time of day and also the date. And the great thing about the sun and sky panel is that you could do sun studies. If you had a project with a courtyard or if you were in a dense urban setting and you were working on a tall building, you could see exactly what types of shadows your project will cast at various times of year. Therefore, you could design a courtyard for a certain location and simulate various times of day for various moments in the year, and have some confidence in your design that you are not designing something that was completely in shadow. We're not going to go through sun studies in this tutorial, but just be aware that that's one way that you could use the sun and sky panel in V-Ray and Rhino. You can see here we have some really nice, interesting reflections in the object. The sky itself is very generic. We get a hint of the sun. Obviously the sun is invisible, but if I unclicked that and did a quick render using the region render, actually the sun is not popping in there, but we could probably get a little pinpoint of the sun somewhere in the scene if I re-rendered it. But before I go into bringing in more dramatic sky textures, I just want to look briefly at some of the other settings here in the sun system. And the one that I really want to focus on is the turbidity. And the turbidity simulates particles in the air. If the maximum value that you can give to this is 20, and if I set this at 20 and then hit render, you can see that I have this very sort of strange yellow sky in the background, and there's actually quite a sort of interesting coloration happening on the spheres now. So it's not at all a let's say, naturalistic view at this point, but it does produce quite an interesting effect. If we knock this down to 9 and render it, you can see that it still looks somewhat naturalistic, but the sky back in the background looks quite a bit hazier. Just compare that to a turbidity value of 3, and I'll do a region render instead of a full render so that you can tell the difference. You can see that the sky is, it's a much deeper blue with a turbidity value of 3 versus a turbidity value of 9, and then if we take it to 20, you get this very strange post-apocalyptic nuclear winter sky, which is pretty interesting. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. We set the turbidity back to 3 and turn off the region render. I'm also going to look at some of the other sky settings. So there's one called CIE clear, and let me just do another region render actually. And so the clear is actually not that much different from the Preetham sky. There may be some subtle differences, but the largest difference, or the most dramatically different sky system available in V-Ray is the CIE overcast. And I'll turn off region render, and this gives us a much more muted sky. And so this is more like an overcast, cloudy day. There are no clouds, but it's more like a Nordic or Scandinavian light, if you will. And this can also be quite interesting. If I change the turbidity, let's see if that does anything. Let me just render that. doesn't have a dramatic change. It is making the image darker, but it doesn't seem to be having the dramatic change in color that we were seeing with the default Preetham sky. So I would say that the Nordic sky, or what I'm calling the Nordic sky, the CIE overcast, is just a nice default alternative to the happy blue sky. It's a little bit more abstract, I think, and maybe a little less cheesy. It doesn't give us much in the way of background that gets pulled into our object, but it is a nice alternative to the Preetham. So having said that, I'm going to go back to the Preetham sky for a moment and render this. And so you can see in this image that we are getting some nice depth. We're getting some subtle highlights. We're getting the blue, coloring the object subtly. But if we really want something like this, and this is again Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate sculpture in Chicago, of course one of the reasons why this large reflective object is so powerful is because it pulls in the sky and pulls in the environment onto the object. And so in order to get something like this happening in V-Ray, we're going to have to replace in our environment settings the procedural sky with a texture. And typically, for this operation, a high dynamic range image is used. And so an HDRI image is simply an image that has more light settings embedded in the image than a normal photograph. So HDRI images are sometimes images like this, which are called tone-mapped HDRI images, in which a composite image is built up out of a series of exposures, and they're blended together so that you get a more dynamic range of tone and color. You can see that pretty clearly in this image, which blends two exposures together in a much more subtle way than the previous image. With one exposure, the background is, or the foreground or middle ground here is visible, but the highlighted areas are blown out. In this other exposure setting, we see everything else, but then this middle ground area is too dark, and so these two exposures are taken and then blended into this one image. And so another example of that is this series of exposures taken inside what appears to be a church, and then they are tone mapped and blended together, composited together in this image, which on the one hand maps, perhaps matches more closely the dynamic range that the human eye could see in a scene, but at the same time it's not that successful as a photograph because of the tone mapping. It starts to look quite artificial and starts to look a bit like a bad CGI rendering, and that's why HDRI photos can be kind of interesting, but they also come off as a bit let's say ham-fisted, not that subtle, a little cheesy. In this case, it's done with a bit more care. So HDRI images are sometimes, when we discuss HDRI images, we are sometimes talking about tone-mapped images like this, but then we're also talking about a file format which often has more, there's multiple exposures embedded into a single image file. And even when that's not the case, HDRI can sometimes be shorthand for just an image taken with a spherical camera that could potentially have all of those exposure settings embedded in it, but need not necessarily have all of those exposure settings embedded in it to be used for our purposes. So if you search for, so here I just did a search for HDRI, you're going to see a number of environment maps, or let's say images of environments taken with a spherical camera, which we can bring into V-Ray and map around our scene. So I have already no, I have not. So what I'm going to do is view this image, and I'm just going to pull it down into a folder. And so now I have this in a folder. It's called Atlantic Spherical HDRI Panorama. And I don't believe this is a true HDRI image. It may have started as an HDRI image, or it could be an HDRI image that someone has already tone mapped and blended all of those exposure settings together. And therefore we could use this for illuminating our scene. And so, so that's what I'm going to do right now. So this is where our scene is right now, and what I'm going to do is replace this this blue background with the image that that we're seeing here. So in order to do that, I need to go back to the V-Ray options. Pull that up so we can see it. And we are going to look at the Environment tab. And so we're not going to change the skylight yet. We'll see what happens when we change the skylight to the image. But first we're going to look at the reflection and refraction, which is what V-Ray is in parentheses calling our background. And we're going to go to the mapping channel by clicking the capital M here. And since it's capitalized, we know we have something in the mapping channel for the background. And as we covered in a previous tutorial, we have the V-Ray sun and sky system, which we made. And we selected that originally. Originally was set to none, so there was nothing in this mapping channel. And we scrolled down and we chose sky, and then we chose this object, the identifier for the sun and sky system that we made in a previous tutorial. So I'm going to go back and set this to none. And so if we want to now map the HDRI image into this mapping slot, we are going to scroll down, and actually we don't even need to scroll down. There's a bitmap option, so it's TEX bitmap. I'm going to select that, and then it's prompting me to open the bitmap file, and so I quickly have to find where I put that. So let me just go ahead and copy that address and put that in here, and I'm going to find that image, and the name is quite long, but hopefully that's fine. I'm going to open it, and okay, so I preview this. Now, I'm seeing my image, but I'm not quite done yet. I need to scroll down to the bottom of this window and change the UVW type. And the UVW just tips us off that that this setting is dealing with the mapping of the texture. So there's a U setting, a V setting, and then the W setting, and we're going to move this from a general channel mapping to a environmental, or a general environment mapping. And then the mapping type is automatically, or should be automatically, set to spherical, which is what we want, because we want V-Ray to treat this like this image was taken with a spherical camera, and we essentially want it to V-Ray to rewrap this texture map around the scene so that it's a 360-degree spherical map all the way around the scene. So wherever we look, we're going to see that texture. That's how the texture has been unrolled, and now we're rolling it back up. So we're going to hit OK. And let's hit render. We're probably going to have to change the multiplier here, but let's just go ahead and do an initial render and see what we see. Okay, so our rendering looks quite different. I don't know if it's visible in the recording, but there is a hint of the sky in the background. It's just incredibly dark. And so what we need to do is go back to the options, and this number adjacent to the mapping box is a multiplier. And so by increasing this value, we're going to be pumping, V-Ray is going to pump more light through the image. So the image itself is actually casting light into the scene to a degree, and it has a brightness. So actually we could maybe, in this case, we're going to think of this as maybe it's not pumping light into the scene so much, but it has a brightness, and maybe if we map it to the skylight, then that's where it will be pumping light into the scene. But we're just going to change this brightness. So I'm going to go up to a much larger number of 50 and see what happens. Okay. So now you can see we have a much brighter background, and we're also starting to get a much more legible series of reflections in our spherical object. So just to reinforce that this is really wrapping from every direction. We're going to look at the scene from a different view. And so every angle from which we might view this object, given the nature of the texture map, we're going to see the texture showing up in the object, and we're going to see it in the background. Now, obviously, it's a bit washed out in the background, so I'm going to tweak the settings a little bit. I'm going to go back to the V-Ray options, and I'm going to look and see what happens if I replace our sky mapping, which we now have in the global illumination skylight environment channel, if I change that also to this bitmap. Okay. And again, going down and changing this general to general environment spherical, previewing it. Okay. So let's see quickly what happens now when I render. Doesn't look that different. There is a difference here on the ground, on this base plate. And if I pump, let's say, more light into this is says the intensity of the GI color. So let's try that again. Alright, so now that seems to have been corrected a little bit down here. So we're not getting so much of the yellow tint from the actual sun. And then if I knock this down to maybe 30 in the reflection, maybe our sky won't be quite so blown out. Okay, great. And let me get rid of that and then do another rendering. So now I have a very a very different rendering than I did with just the default V-Ray sun and sky. Kind of look over this object and render it. Does look like it's on a raft in the middle of the ocean, but I am getting some nice sort of cloud texturing happening everywhere on this object. And so it's now that you know how to import HDRI maps, this becomes a very, very easy way to dramatically change your scene quite quickly. So if I just go back to my web browser, and again I just did a search for HDRI, and using the search tools in Google, set this to large so it was getting high quality images. Let's find something that's quite a bit different or more dramatic. Let's see, there's not all of them are outside, and I have some other HDRIs, some of which I've put, or both of which are on my homework folder. So let's just grab this one since it's quite different, and it has many more things in the middle of the image which we can now reflect. I'm going to view this image. And if I go to my folder and just pull this over. Okay, so let's see what happens when we pull this into our view. Alright, so this is, I'm going to just close this, go back to V-Ray, and go to the options. And I'm now just going to quickly replace that map. So that's in there. And so that was in the skylight. And I'm going and just clicking the ellipsis next to the file, this little box next to the file name, swapping out the ocean and sky HDRI for this one, previewing it. And here we go. And let's see what this gives us. So very different reflections now happening. You can see that we get this sort of city scene happening in the background here. And if I can move and go close to the object and render it, I'm getting a very different effect now. A little strange, especially when I'm not quite sure what this. Oh, I see. It's an umbrella. But this is just to show that you can get very, very different effects. And one of the issues, of course, is that this scene seems like it's taken at a the photograph, the HDRI photograph, was taken in the evening, and our shadows don't necessarily reflect that. Obviously, I have I really have the multipliers pumped up on the image, so it's quite bright in the background. But it is possible using, we still have the sun and sky system working. We're just not using we're using the direct light of the sun. We're not really using the image files to exclusively illuminate this image. So you have to be careful when using HDRIs that the background doesn't become completely out of tune with the shadows and the brightness of the sun that you have casting into the scene. But before I conclude this tutorial, I want to look at a completely different HDRI style, let's say. And in the on my homework folder and in this directory, I have a couple of HDRI files. These are, pull this up, a series of what we would call, let's say, a studio lighting scenario, or these are all studio lighting scenarios, where you might have a series of diffuse reflectors and point lights, lights of various colors, casting light onto your object. And so this is much more like you would, let's say this is a setup that you would use for photographing a product or a car or an object. And so let's just see how, and some of these can be incredibly good for getting exotic reflections. And let's see, I've got 10 and 15. And so 10 is one that has a series of lights arrayed around the object, and 15 is one that has a series of lights above the object with this very recognizable crossing pattern in the lights. So let's see how those work when we set them up. And I'm going to map them exactly the same way. I'm just here, I'm going to go ahead and replace these JPEGs, this HDRI. And I'll do the same thing here. 10 HDRI. And close this. And now we're going to render it. Okay, so something didn't quite work out there. So let me go back to the mapping here. HDRI. Open. Okay. Go back. Okay, so that's in there. Go to this one. Hit OK. And let me try rendering it again. Okay, and so now we have a series of pretty nice reflections on this object. And let me close this and rotate around. So you can see the way that these side lights are really nicely illuminating the object. It doesn't give us much in the way of background, but that can be okay. We might actually just render this as a separate pass and use it to just bring a subtle reflection on top of our image in Photoshop, fading this layer back or using one of the layer filters to sort of add some dimension to our rendering. This might be a good time to note that how you save the images will influence what you see. So what I mean by that is we have a background in this image. It's quite abstract, but it is there. And if we save this image as a JPEG, and so let's save this as test1 JPEG, and that's just popping into my desktop. And so if I open that object, I'm going to see the image and I'm going to see the background. So this is the HDRI file in the background. And however, if I save this as a PNG file, for example, and a PNG file is a file format that can have an alpha channel, it can have transparency. I'll call this test01, and it's test01 PNG now. If I open this, there's no environment, and what this means is that I could open the PNG in Photoshop with alright, so I'm pulling this up in Photoshop, and you can see I have nothing in the background. I can make a new layer. I could select that and let's say fill it with a completely new color. Okay, Shift F5, the foreground color. And so now I have a very different background than what I was seeing in V-Ray. And this is something that I'm going to recommend that you do. I mean, you could really bring in any background that you want. This is another way you're not bound to the sky texture of an HDRI. I open this with Photoshop. You could just as easily bring this image into the background. It looks a little strange, but I could easily position that and fade it back. I'd use these layer filters to do something interesting with it potentially, and give it's kind of nice actually. Screen, I can see a little bit of the background. Yeah, so. There are a lot of things that you could do just by having the background not included with the base image. And there are, in general, a lot of things that you can do with layer filters. One thing, you always want to try Shift Control L, which will adjust the levels of the object. And I often duplicate a layer and then just hit Shift Control L to see what the most extreme range of contrast is for that particular layer. And you can always then, so this is how it came in, this is the more extreme version, and then by changing the opacity you can find something in between, and usually that's going to give your image a bit more punch. I can also duplicate this layer and just scroll through and see what the different layer settings do. So with color dodge, I'm getting sort of interesting highlights around, interesting pumping on highlights. Overlay often can really sort of increase the contrast of the image. You can also try, if I go back to the color dodge. One thing you might try is if you filter this and blur the layer, so give that a Gaussian blur, and blur this stuff. So that's going to change things a little bit. As you can see, I'm getting some haze now on the edges of the object. Have to be careful with this. So that's pumping things up, and then of course we can sort of fade that in to make it a bit more subtle. So now with that we're getting a bit of glow around the edges of the object, so especially we see that here. If I turn this off, these areas are glowing a bit more around. And let's see if we can see that. Okay, so, so how you save your image from V-Ray is going to really determine whether or not you have a background. So a JPEG will include the background that you see in the frame buffer, and PNG will not. And to conclude this tutorial, I'm just going to look at the last HDRI studio map that I had. So that's 15. Hit OK. Just click into the background here. 15. OK. OK. And I'll just quickly do a. We should see a lot more lighting. So the original studio HDRI that I used had a lot of lights ringing around the sides of the scene, and this one has much more lighting from the top, which we can now see here. So now we see those top lights, and if I click this and so this gives me a very, very different series of reflections on the object. And I haven't done anything to my scene. The shift in the way that this scene is being rendered is happening exclusively by changing the background. And that's made possible by knowing how to bring maps into V-Ray, and also, of course, by having reflective materials, which can take advantage of these backgrounds. And that concludes this tutorial.